Imagine waking up in the dead of night to a voice, whispering right in your ear, as if someone invisible is only inches away. Start with this chilling line, delivered in a hushed, ominous tone to grab the audience immediately. From the darkness, reveal a story that begins with an ordinary night disrupted by a single, inexplicable event that spirals into pure horror. Let the viewers know that what they're about to hear is not a fictional tale, but a real account, one that the protagonist relives every time they dare to sleep. Mention that this is a first-person narration, allowing the audience to experience each pulse of fear, each moment of confusion and terror, as if they're living it themselves. Introduce the story with a slow, unsettling description. It's late, the room is silent, and the protagonist is fast asleep, until a sensation, a presence, drags them awake. The narrator describes feeling an icy breath near their ear, and then, a faint whisper that doesn't quite form words, but sounds like someone trying to speak, almost inside their own head. In the disorienting moments between sleep and waking, the protagonist opens their eyes, heart pounding, only to be met with a room shrouded in shadows. Then, out of the corner of their eye, they notice something. Their computer chair, motionless at first, begins to turn on its own. Slowly, as if moved by an unseen hand, it completes one full spin and then another, each rotation slow and deliberate, as if something is sitting there watching them waiting. Build the mystery and suspense further by emphasizing the surreal horror of this moment. In a locked room, with the windows shut and no draft, the chair just kept moving, the narrator says, their voice trembling. They can't breathe, can't move, as they realize that whatever was whispering has now left its mark, tampering with the very objects around them. Make it clear that this isn't just fear. It's an invasive, paralyzing dread, as the protagonist senses that they are not alone. Close this introduction with a suspenseful call to action, inviting viewers to join this journey into the supernatural. If you think you're safe, if you believe there's nothing lurking in the shadows, stay with me until the end, and I promise you'll see that some nightmares are very, very real. The protagonist's footsteps echo in the silence, each step hesitant, as though the floorboards themselves are testing their resolve. The deeper they go into the house, the more suffocating the air becomes, thick, stale, and almost damp, as if no one had disturbed it for years. Every corner seems to hide a secret. Every shadow hints at movement just beyond their vision. There's an unshakable feeling that they're being drawn somewhere, lured by an unseen force that whispers through the walls. Their pulse quickens, a cold sweat forming on their brow, as they turn down a narrow corridor that looks longer than they remember, stretching into darkness. At the end of the hallway, a door stands slightly ajar, revealing just a sliver of the room beyond. There's something wrong about that room, something deeply unnatural. Even from a distance, the protagonist can sense it, a strange, overpowering feeling that whatever lies within is not of this world. The dim light filtering from the room casts eerie shapes onto the floor, twisting and shifting like living things. With each step toward the door, their apprehension grows, but something inside them, a morbid curiosity, perhaps, or a need for answers, pushes them forward. They stop just outside the door, close enough to hear faint sounds from within. At first, it's nothing more than a low hum, barely audible, but then it becomes something darker, a sound that's almost human yet distorted, like a voice dragged through layers of static and shadow. It's a soft, mournful wail that sends chills down their spine, a sound that speaks of loneliness, despair, and something else, a warning. Their hand trembles as they reach out to push the door open, and as they do, the wailing stops, replaced by a silence so thick it feels as though the air itself has turned solid, pressing down on them. Inside, the room is almost completely dark, save for a faint glow coming from an old, dust-covered mirror on the far wall. The mirror seems misplaced, standing alone in a room otherwise devoid of furniture. As they step closer, they can feel a strange energy emanating from it, a pulse like a heartbeat that vibrates through the floor and up their legs. They stare into the mirror, expecting to see only their reflection, but the glass shows something else. Behind their reflection, a figure slowly begins to materialize, faint at first, just a shadow. But as they watch, it takes form, a tall, thin silhouette with hollow eyes and a face twisted in agony. The protagonist's breath catches, their skin crawling as they realize the figure in the mirror is looking directly at them, as if aware of their presence. The figure raises a hand, mirroring their movements, but there's a delay, a fraction of a second too slow, like an echo trying to catch up. They lift their hand to touch the glass, compelled by some strange force, and as their fingers near the mirror, the room around them seems to shift, the walls closing in, the floor creaking beneath them. Suddenly, the figure in the mirror grins, a horrifying, unnatural smile that stretches wider and wider, revealing rows of sharp, darkened teeth. In that instant, the door behind them slams shut, sealing them inside. Panic rises as they turn to the door, desperate to escape, but it's locked tight, the doorknob cold and unyielding under their grip. The mirror behind them begins to hum, louder and louder, filling the room with a low, vibrating sound that shakes the walls. They turn back to see the figure stepping closer, pressing its hand against the glass as though trying to break through. Its eyes, hollow and dark, seem to pull them in, drawing them closer to the mirror as if under a spell. The room grows colder, the air thick with an unnatural chill, and a sense of dread fills their every thought. Realizing they can't escape, the protagonist takes a step back, watching as the figure presses harder against the mirror, cracks beginning to spiderweb across the glass. The figure's mouth opens, releasing a soundless scream that fills their mind with images of despair and fear, an endless loop of darkness. They can't look away, trapped by the gaze of whatever is lurking within the mirror, and as the cracks widen, they feel as though they're being pulled toward the glass, as if the mirror itself is a gateway to a world of horror from which they might never return. It started with a whisper, a faint, almost inaudible sound that drifted through the stillness of the night. At first, the protagonist dismissed it as nothing more than the creak of old wood settling, or perhaps a trick of their tired mind. But as the silence stretched on, the whisper grew more persistent, weaving through the darkness like a thread unraveling some hidden, sinister truth. They lay in bed, frozen, straining to hear, and there it was again, a soft, garbled murmur coming from the shadows as though someone, or something, was speaking just out of sight. It was unintelligible, but there was an urgency to it, a note of distress, like a plea for help that clawed at their nerves. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the room itself were holding its breath. A sudden chill settled over them, seeping through the blankets and into their bones. The temperature dropped unnaturally fast, the kind of cold that doesn't belong in the warmth of a house, wrapping around them like icy fingers. Every hair on their body stood on end, an instinctive warning that something wasn't right. They reached for the lamp beside their bed, fingers trembling as they fumbled for the switch. But the light flickered only briefly before going out, plunging the room back into shadow. They were alone, or so they hoped, swallowed by the oppressive darkness that seemed to breathe around them. Then came the sound of movement, a soft scrape, as though something were brushing against the walls. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, closer, filling the silence with an eerie rhythm that echoed through the room. The sound was deliberate, each scrape slow and methodical, as though whatever was making it wanted to be heard. They clutched the blankets, heart pounding, eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of what might be lurking there. But there was nothing, only shadows that seemed to shift and writhe as though alive, mocking their helplessness. The sensation of being watched was undeniable now, an oppressive weight pressing down on them from all directions. They could feel eyes on them, cold and unblinking, studying them from the shadows, assessing, waiting. The urge to run, to escape, pulsed through them, but something stronger held them in place. A primal fear that told them if they moved, if they acknowledged the presence, it would only grow bolder. They lay still, barely daring to breathe, hoping that whatever it was would lose interest and vanish back into the darkness. But then something moved in the corner of the room, a shape dark and indistinct, shifting just beyond the edge of their vision. They turned, heart hammering, but the shape was gone, leaving only an impression, a lingering sense that it was still there, hiding, watching. Their pulse raced as they scanned the room, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but the darkness revealed nothing. And then, without warning, a cold, sharp breath brushed against their ear, a sensation so real that they gasped, jerking back in terror. They could feel it, something close, too close, the air disturbed by a presence that should not exist. Desperation drove them to call out, their voice barely more than a whisper. "Who's there?" But the only response was silence, thick and impenetrable, swallowing their words as if the room itself refused to answer. Just when they thought they couldn't bear it any longer, the chair by their desk creaked, the sound echoing like a scream in the quiet. They turned to see it slowly begin to spin, once, then twice, as though someone had given it a gentle push. But they were alone, the windows shut tight, no breeze to explain the movement. The chair stilled, but the sense of dread only deepened, an electric tension in the air, as if something unseen was standing right behind them, watching, waiting for them to make the next move. The whisper returned, closer this time, a low hiss that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wrapped around them, filling their ears with words they couldn't understand, words that sounded ancient, angry, hungry. Panic surged as the realization dawned on them. Whatever was in this room wasn't just watching. It was reaching out, pushing against the boundary between its world and theirs, trying to make itself known, to cross over. The protagonist sat frozen, paralyzed by fear, as the unseen presence pressed closer, a chill creeping up their spine. They could feel its breath, cold and damp, inches from their face, filling the air with the metallic scent of decay. In that suffocating moment, a single, terrifying thought took hold: it wasn't alone. The protagonist is gripped by a chilling realization that something is undeniably wrong. Every instinct urges them to flee, to escape the clutches of this unseen presence that lurks in the shadows. But there's a pull, a morbid curiosity, a need for answers, that keeps them rooted in place, frozen between fear and an insatiable urge to understand the darkness that has invaded their world. They stare into the darkness, their breath shallow, heart pounding, as they weigh their options. They could run, pretend this night was a fevered nightmare, lock the door, and try to forget. But they know deep down that whatever is here isn't something that can be easily forgotten. This is the kind of fear that leaves scars on the soul. A voice inside whispers to ignore it, to hide under the covers and wait for morning. Yet another voice, faint but insistent, pushes them forward. It's as if the darkness itself calls out, tempting them with the promise of forbidden knowledge, of answers that few would dare to seek. The protagonist rises slowly, their legs weak, as if weighted down by an invisible force. Each step toward the source of the whispers feels like a surrender, a small piece of their courage slipping away with every movement. The silence presses in around them, thick and suffocating, as they inch closer to the spot where the shadows seem to gather most intensely, a dark corner of the room that appears deeper, blacker than the rest. They pause, one trembling hand reaching out as if to touch the very fabric of the darkness. The air is cold against their fingertips, unnaturally so, as if a chasm of ice lies just beyond the veil of reality. The urge to turn back is almost overwhelming, every instinct screaming at them to stop, to retreat. But they push forward, compelled by something they can't explain. A strange compulsion that feels both foreign and familiar, as though they've been here before, as though they were meant to face this moment. Their hand hovers in the air, inches away from the darkness, and in that instant, they feel it. A presence, immense and ancient, lurking just beyond their reach. A sound echoes through the room, faint but unmistakable, the creak of floorboards, as if something heavy, something massive, has shifted in the darkness. They jerk back, heart racing, every nerve screaming that they're not alone. The shadow in the corner seems to pulse, expanding and contracting, as though it's breathing, alive, aware of their fear. A voice, a low, guttural whisper that chills them to the bone, calls their name, drawn out and lingering, echoing through the silence like a forgotten memory. They know they should run, that staying is inviting something dangerous, something that belongs to a world of shadows and nightmares. But despite the terror, they take another step forward, driven by a mix of horror and fascination. The room feels heavier with each step, as though the air itself is thickening, pressing down on them, making it harder to breathe. They reach out again, fingers trembling, and as they make contact with the shadow, a cold rush floods their senses, a feeling of emptiness, of a void that stretches endlessly. They pull their hand back in shock, but the sensation lingers, a numbness that crawls up their arm and into their chest. It's as if the shadow has marked them, leaving an imprint, a parting gift that they'll never be able to erase. In that moment, they realize the terrible truth: they're no longer in control. This presence, this darkness, has woven itself into their mind, feeding on their curiosity, on their fear. It whispers promises, secrets, truths that dance just beyond comprehension, tantalizing them with the lure of forbidden knowledge. The protagonist stands at a crossroads, torn between retreating to the safety of the light or surrendering completely to the pull of the darkness. They could end it here, close the door on whatever lurks in that shadowed corner. But they can feel it, the hunger of the unknown, pulling them forward, offering answers to questions they never dared ask. Their final decision is made with a shaky breath and a pounding heart. They step fully into the darkness, crossing an invisible line, leaving behind the world they knew. As the protagonist steps into the heart of the darkness, the air thickens and a strange, oppressive silence falls over the room. They feel the presence draw closer, an invisible weight pressing down on their shoulders, making every breath a struggle. In the corner of the room, shadows twist and coil, forming a shape that is barely human. A dark figure, shifting as though made of smoke, its edges blurring and reforming in a slow, unnatural rhythm. The figure doesn't move towards them, It simply watches, its hollow eyes fixed, unblinking, absorbing every tremor of their fear. A chill floods through the room, so cold it burns, seeping into their bones as they take a step back, instinctively trying to escape. But the door behind them is gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving them trapped with whatever creature this is. Something that doesn't belong to the world of the living, something that exists on the edge of nightmares. They can feel its gaze, an intense, consuming darkness that pierces their soul, stripping away any comfort or safety they'd ever known. The figure leans forward, just enough that they catch a glimpse of a face, a pale, twisted version of something that might have once been human, but is now frozen in eternal torment, mouth stretched into a silent scream. The protagonist's heartbeat thunders in their ears, each beat amplifying the dread that pulses through their body. They try to move, to break free from the spell of horror that binds them, but they're paralyzed, as though the figure's gaze has locked them in place. The silence is shattered by a low, guttural whisper, dripping with malice, a voice that seems to come from within their own mind. "You shouldn't have come here," it says, the words slithering through their thoughts like poison, filling them with an overwhelming sense of regret and despair. The voice is ancient, carrying the weight of centuries, and its words are not a threat, they're a promise. A faint light flickers somewhere in the darkness, illuminating the figure's features just enough for them to see the emptiness in its eyes. It steps forward, each movement slow, deliberate, as though savoring the moment, drawing closer until it stands only inches away. The stench of decay fills the air, mingling with a strange, metallic scent that turns their stomach. The figure reaches out a skeletal hand, its fingers long and claw-like, dripping with a dark, viscous substance that stains the air around it. The protagonist tries to scream, but the sound dies in their throat, swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence that surrounds them. The hand hovers in front of their face, inches from their skin, and they feel a coldness radiating from it, a chill so intense it feels as though it could freeze them solid. The figure tilts its head, studying them with an expression that's almost curious, as though it's deciding what to do next. Its mouth opens, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, blackened and broken, and a foul breath escapes, filling the room with the smell of rot and death. In a sudden, violent movement, the figure leans in, whispering something in a language they can't understand, words that burn into their mind like fire, leaving behind an echo of despair and madness. And then, in a horrifying instant, the figure reaches through them, its hand passing through their chest as though they were made of air. The sensation is unbearable, a cold, sickening emptiness that spreads through their body, as if the creature is pulling something out of them, stealing a piece of their soul. They feel weaker, drained, as though a part of their very essence is being consumed, absorbed by this thing from beyond. The figure's eyes seem to brighten, filled with a dark hunger, a satisfaction that twists its face into a grotesque smile. The protagonist collapses to their knees, gasping for breath, their body shaking with terror and exhaustion. The figure lingers, watching them, as if savoring its victory, before slowly retreating into the shadows, fading back into the darkness from which it came. But the room doesn't feel empty. The presence lingers, an imprint of horror burned into the air. The protagonist can sense that they are forever marked, a part of them left behind in that dark place, claimed by the supernatural force that now haunts them. They crawl toward the door, weak and disoriented, but as they reach for the handle, they feel a whisper against their ear, a final parting gift from the figure. "I'll be waiting," it says, its voice like the last breath of a dying flame, fading but never fully extinguished. The protagonist stumbles out of the room, feeling that even in the safety of daylight, they will never be alone again. As the protagonist stumbles away, they feel the weight of something heavy clinging to them, as if a part of that dark figure is still tethered to their soul. Each step feels harder than the last, the air thick and suffocating, almost like they're moving through a dense fog. They can't shake the feeling that they're being followed, even as they leave the room behind, shutting the door in a desperate attempt to separate themselves from whatever they encountered. But the house feels different now, more hostile, as though the walls themselves are alive, listening, watching. They rush down the hallway, but each shadow seems to lengthen, twisting toward them with an eerie, almost predatory intent. It's as if the entire house has become a trap, a web designed to hold them in place. Their breaths come faster, shallower, and a sickening realization blooms in their mind. Whatever that thing was, it has somehow marked them, bound them to itself. They stop, leaning against the wall, and for a moment, they feel a strange warmth on their chest, right where the figure's hand had passed through them. They pull back their shirt, and to their horror, a dark, faintly glowing mark pulses beneath their skin, a symbol that seems to writhe and shift as though alive. Panicked, they claw at the mark, but it only grows brighter, sending a cold, numbing sensation through their body. The whispers return, louder now, echoing in their mind like a chant, repeating the same unintelligible words over and over. The mark burns, filling them with visions, a series of images flashing before their eyes in rapid succession. They see glimpses of countless others, faces twisted in horror, all bearing the same mark, all trapped in a nightmare from which they can never wake. They realize, with a growing sense of dread, that this mark isn't just a scar, it's a curse, a binding seal that connects them to the entity they encountered. In a haze of terror, they stagger into the living room, where everything appears distorted, warped as if viewed through a cracked lens. The clock on the wall ticks backward, the hands moving in jerky, unnatural motions. Shadows pool at the edges of the room, gathering into shapes that resemble twisted, skeletal figures, each one watching them with hollow, black eyes. The protagonist feels the entity's presence looming closer, no longer confined to the dark corner of a single room. It's everywhere now, woven into the very fabric of the house, a creeping, malevolent force that won't let them go. A final, horrifying vision overtakes them. They see themselves standing in that dark room once more, only this time they're not alone. They're surrounded by other figures, all marked with the same cursed symbol, each one a prisoner to the entity. And there in the center is the dark figure, its empty eyes now filled with a knowing, sinister light. It's feeding on their fear, drawing strength from their horror, binding them tighter with each passing second. The protagonist feels themselves slipping, their mind unraveling as the entity pulls them deeper into its world, a realm where time doesn't exist, where the shadows themselves are alive, hungry. In the last moments before they're completely consumed, they understand the truth. The entity is not just a ghost or a creature, it's something far worse. It's a collector of souls, a being that traps its victims in endless darkness, feeding on their terror for eternity. Each person it marks is doomed to wander the shadowy halls of its realm, reliving their horror over and over, never allowed to escape. They realize too late that they're now one of its chosen, a part of its collection, bound to the darkness forever. With a final despairing scream, they feel themselves slipping away, their body going numb, their vision fading as they fall into an endless void. The last thing they hear is the entity's cold, mocking whisper echoing in their mind, "Welcome home." And then there's only darkness, a vast, eternal silence, where fear and despair reign unchallenged, and where escape is a distant, impossible dream. The protagonist is gone, but their soul remains, forever trapped in the shadowy grasp of the entity, a prisoner in a nightmare without end. Days pass, yet the darkness never leaves. The protagonist escapes the house, stumbling back into the daylight, but something feels irrevocably different. The world around them seems washed out, colors muted, as if a thin veil separates them from reality. They go through their days in a daze, haunted by memories that cling to them like a thick, suffocating fog. The mark on their chest hasn't faded. It's now a dark stain beneath the skin, cold to the touch, pulsing faintly with a life of its own, as if tethering them to something lurking just beyond the world of the living. At night, the whispers return, seeping from the shadows of their own bedroom, curling around them like the tendrils of a dark, invasive fog. They lie in bed, heart racing, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close their eyes. They know that if they sleep, they'll return to that place, the cold, endless halls, the twisted figure in the shadows, and the faces of others who are just as trapped as they are. It's as if the house has imprinted itself onto their mind, turning their dreams into an inescapable prison, a dark mirror of their waking world. Each night, they slip back into that nightmare, reliving the terror, feeling the entity's cold, empty eyes watching, always watching. As the days blur into weeks, their friends and family begin to notice the change. They seem distant, distracted, as if they're not fully present, their eyes vacant and haunted. They avoid mirrors, fearing what might look back at them. Shadows cling to their steps, seeming to lengthen, darken, stretching across the walls as though alive. Even in crowded places, they feel utterly alone, the isolation pressing in, squeezing the breath from their lungs. They begin to wonder if they're losing their mind, or if the entity's curse has bound them to a slow descent into madness, a descent from which there is no return. One night, in a desperate attempt to break free, they return to the house. They stand at its door, feeling a wave of dread as they grip the handle, each breath growing shallower, the mark on their chest throbbing in response. The door creaks open, revealing the darkness within, a yawning void that seems to swallow the faint light of the moon. They step inside, and instantly, the silence wraps around them, thick and oppressive. Every instinct screams to run, to leave and never look back, but something stronger pulls them in, an unseen force guiding them deeper, as though they are being drawn to a final reckoning. The house is unchanged, silent, watching, as if waiting for them to fulfill their fate. They find themselves in the same dark room, staring into the familiar mirror that had once shown them the face of the entity. But this time, the mirror is empty, reflecting only shadows, a cold and lifeless void. They raise a hand to the glass, and as they do, a chilling realization settles over them. The mark on their chest begins to burn, filling the room with a cold light, illuminating countless faces trapped within the mirror's surface, faces frozen in horror, all bearing the same cursed mark. They understand now that they're just another soul, another addition to the entity's collection, doomed to join the others in eternal silence. In that moment, the glass shatters, each shard catching a glimpse of their face, eyes wide with terror as the pieces fall to the ground. The room collapses around them, the walls dissolving into darkness, and they feel themselves slipping, falling into a void that stretches on forever. The last sensation they know is the faint brush of icy fingers across their skin, a reminder that they are no longer alone. They are bound to the entity, their soul intertwined with the darkness, a prisoner in a nightmare without end. Back in the real world, friends and family speak of them in whispers, recalling the way they changed, the haunted look in their eyes. But in that house, where shadows cling to every corner, some say they can still feel a presence, a faint whisper, a shadow moving just out of sight, a reminder of the soul that now walks its halls, bound to the darkness, forever seeking escape, forever lost. The days stretch into months, but the memory of that night never fades. The protagonist tries to return to normal life, clinging to the routines that once brought comfort and order. Yet, every shadow seems deeper, every silence more sinister. They begin to avoid dark places altogether, haunted by an unshakable sense that the entity is still watching, lurking just beyond the thin veil of reality. Even in crowded rooms, they feel its gaze, an oppressive presence pressing down, filling their mind with whispers only they can hear. Friends and family notice the changes, a hollow look in their eyes, the way they jump at even the smallest sounds, as though bracing for something that never comes. Their dreams are no longer their own. Each night, they are pulled back to that dark house, wandering its endless corridors, seeing the same twisted faces of those who came before them, their mouths open in silent screams. The entity's voice follows them, wrapping around their thoughts like a suffocating fog, whispering secrets they cannot understand. They wake in the early hours, drenched in cold sweat, with the lingering feeling of cold fingers brushing across their skin. It's a sensation that's impossible to shake, a reminder that they are marked, forever bound to something beyond comprehension, something that feeds on fear and despair. The mark on their chest has faded, but never vanished. In certain lights, they see it faintly pulsing beneath the skin, like an old wound that never fully healed. When they press their fingers against it, a strange numbness spreads through their chest, as though the entity is still connected, still feeding off their fear. It's a brand, a reminder that they are no longer entirely their own, that part of them remains trapped in that dark room, bound to the entity's eternal, insatiable hunger. They can feel its pull, drawing them back to the house, tempting them to surrender completely, to accept the darkness as their fate. They try to confide in others, but their words come out jumbled, sounding like nonsense even to their own ears. People around them begin to distance themselves, whispering behind their back, casting them concerned glances that quickly turn to pity. They see it in the faces of friends, family, strangers. Everyone looks at them as though they're slipping away, becoming something less than human, something haunted and hollow. They start to isolate themselves, retreating into their own world where the whispers and shadows are familiar, where they are not judged, only watched. One evening, as they sit alone in the dim light of their room, they catch a glimpse of movement in the mirror across the room. Their breath catches, and they feel a surge of cold terror as they watch a shadowy figure shift just out of sight, hovering at the edge of the reflection. It's the entity, or perhaps another victim, watching them from the other side, trapped in that eternal darkness they now know too well. The figure's eyes are hollow, empty, filled with the same despair they feel gnawing at their own soul. They realize, with a sickening dread, that they are not just being haunted, they are becoming part of the haunting, merging with the darkness that claimed them. In a final, desperate attempt to break free, they smash the mirror, shattering the reflection, hoping to sever the connection. But as the shards scatter across the floor, each one catches a faint glimpse of their face, eyes wide, hollow, and distant, as though a part of them remains trapped in the shattered glass. They feel a cold hand on their shoulder, an invisible grip that tightens, pulling them down, dragging them back to that dark, endless place. The room around them fades, dissolving into shadows, and they feel themselves slipping, merging with the darkness that has stalked them since that fateful night. In the last moments before they're completely consumed, they realize the horrible truth. They are now part of the entity's world, a shadow among shadows, lost to a nightmare from which there is no escape. They feel their identity, their memories, everything they once were fading, replaced by an empty hunger, a need to haunt, to seek out others who will wander too close to the darkness. They are the whispers now, the shadow that watches from the corner of the room, the face that appears in the mirror at night. Their soul is bound, forever cursed to be a part of the entity's eternal hunt. The people who remember them speak of strange occurrences, a chill in the air, whispers in the dark, shadows that move without cause. Those who venture near the old house feel a sense of dread, a weight pressing down on them, as though something waits, hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. And in the silence, if one listens carefully, they might hear a voice, soft, faint, filled with a sorrow that transcends time, calling for help, a whisper from the darkness, "Don't come any closer, or you'll end up like me." But the warning always goes unheard, and the entity's collection grows, one soul at a time, bound eternally to the shadows.